Hi, everybody. Thanks very much for joining us. We're glad you're here. Welcome to our Green Living Seminar presentation tonight. I'm Elena Traister, Professor of Environmental Studies here at MCLA. So this semester's Green Living Seminar is organized around the theme, Greening the City. All of these presentations are free and open to the public. They take place on Wednesdays here in the Feigenbaum Center for Science and Innovation at 5:30. Room 121. We have our schedule posted online and also links to previous presentation recordings. If you go to mcla.edu/greenliving, one word. And before I turn it over to tonight's presenter, just a quick announcement about upcoming presentations. So we're not going to meet next week because it is MCLA's spring break. So don't come back next week, but please do come back the following week on Wednesday, March 23rd. We'll have a presentation by Dr. Madeline Scammell, Associate Professor of Environmental Health at Boston University School of Public Health, whose presentation is titled Public Health and Community-Based Participatory Research in Urban Environmental Justice Communities. Today's presentation on backyard habitats for bees will be given by Dr. Susannah Lerman, research ecologist with the U.S. Forest Service. Thanks so much for coming to do this today. This over. Sounds great.
Okay, well, this is my first presentation that I have given since, let's see, February 2020. So this is fun to do this live. So thank you for letting me see if I can do this again. So I'm excited to be here. But let's get started. Let's see if I get this right. Here we go. Who here likes to eat? Who likes strawberries? Okay, if you like strawberries, you need bees. Okay, so we know bees, they perform this incredible ecosystem service for us. They pollinate roughly 87% of all of our flowering plants. And so this includes both of our agricultural plants and also our ornamentals and our trees and our shrubs and our flowers. They also, it's estimated a $56 billion service every year. So again, if you like to eat, you like bees, we need bees. But also bees need us. How many of you have heard about bees, their populations have been just really crashing, right? So most of the news has been about honeybees, but there's, our native bees are also in huge, huge problems. And kind of the two main reasons, what we can see is just this intensification of agriculture and also the loss of habitat from urban development. And both of these are, really getting at the loss of habitat in these different areas. And when we think about urban development, there's, yes, definitely the loss of habitat, and there's also the gain of some habitat with these pollinator gardens. And so if you walk down the street, not today, but in a couple of months when the sun is out and the snow has disappeared, you'll probably start seeing some of these plantings. And there has been research that has demonstrated that these plantings do, in fact, work. So this could be a really positive way that we can try to help bees. It's also really demonstrating that our yards can play a significant role in bee conservation and wildlife conservation in general. And this idea of our yards providing habitat has been around for a really long time. And so this is one of my favorite publications from 1973 by Jack Ward Thomas and Dick DeGraff. So these are two former Forest Service scientists. And so the whole idea of inviting wildlife into our backyards has a really long history within the US Forest Service. And it really represents the shift, whereas a lot of wildlife biologists at the time really thought that when we think about habitat, it happens out there, out in the wilderness, out in these wild places. Why do we need to think about conserving habitat right outside in our backyards? And so this really started this shift in this idea of really trying to think about these urban systems, these cities, as places for wildlife, as these ecosystems. And just as a side note, Jack Ward Thomas, after he finished this publication, went on to be the chief of the US Forest Service in the mid-'80s and really kind of brought the Forest Service through the spotted owl controversy out in the Pacific Northwest. But I like to think, and he had all these meetings with President Clinton back at the time to really trying to figure out ways to reconcile logging with wildlife habitat. But it really gives me a lot of pleasure knowing that he got his start thinking about backyard habitats. One of the things that a lot of these different programs of how to create wildlife in your backyard, there's two main things that they've been really trying to push. One is to have native plants, and there's a lot of research. I can come back another day, talk about the importance of native plants. And the other component that they're really trying to get at is to remove or significantly reduce the amount of lawns that we have in our landscapes. So in fact, that's a big number. 163,800 square kilometers of lawns cover the United States. So what does that number mean? Like how much is 163,800 square kilometers? So that's roughly the size of the state of Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Massachusetts. So it's a lot of grass. And here you can see some of these other statistics in terms of what kind of habitat, what kind of components are these different types of lawns doing for our urban landscapes. And they're really covering up a huge amount of area. And because of the way that most people seem to be landscaping or managing their lawns, I really like this quote from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, calling them biodiversity deserts, although I do have a problem with calling it because I think deserts actually have a lot to them, and that they're relatively useless for birds and bees. And so I used to think this too, because look at this. It doesn't have any sort of structure. There's probably a lot of water that goes into this, a lot of chemicals to make it look like this beautiful golf course. And so when people would ask me, what is one thing we can do? I'm like, oh, well, let's plant native plants and get rid of your lawn. And so I used to wave this flag too. But I started thinking about this number a lot more, 163,800 square kilometers. It's going to be nearly impossible for us to get rid of or significantly reduce the amount of lawns in the United States. So I started rethinking this idea, and it came up with this new kind of mantra that really kind of drives a lot of my research. How do we make our lawns less bad? And so about 10 years ago, I started diving pretty deep into lawn management. It was something I'm trained as a field ornithologist, and so to start thinking about lawns was really quite a change for me. But I started realizing that there are a lot of things that people are doing to these lawns. And so they happen along these different temporal scales, whether it's daily irrigation, weekly mowing, or seasonally applying different types of fertilizers. And there's been some research that has looked at these different behaviors, and what we've found is that the majority of people are mowing every week, whereas things like applying fertilizer and irrigation, between 50 to 60% of Americans surveyed. So mowing is really the number one component, and roughly like 95 to 98% of those who have a lawn are mowing. Why do we mow? And so our lawns are really this social construct. So they're really this idea of really trying to present this different way that we are to our neighbors. It's a way of really kind of this extension of our home. And so we want our lawns to look nice, primarily for the neighbors. And so it's really trying to get at these aesthetics. And so one of the things I was thinking about, though, and so this is my house here, and there's about 10 years ago, my husband and I would take turns mowing the lawn, and it was his turn to mow. And I noticed that he left a lot of different patches out in the lawn. And I thought, well, that's kind of strange. Like, why didn't he just go back and forth in these rows? And I thought, well, maybe there are some of our kids' toys that were out in the lawn. And so after he was done, I went out and to try to figure out, well, why did he leave these patches? And what I noticed was that he left these patches of flowers that were growing in the lawn. Now, we're really these lazy kind of gardeners where we don't have the time or the effort. We're not going to bother to plant these flowers, but it was like, oh, if flowers emerge, we're going to keep them. So that was pretty neat. And then, although as I mentioned, I'm an ornithologist, so I'm usually looking up, I tended to look down at this time because I was looking at the flowers, and what I noticed was that there are these bees buzzing around. So there's bumblebees that were going around to the clover and some of the other flowers in the lawns. And I started thinking, well, what happens if we don't mow our lawns and we leave these flowers there? And so I started to think a little bit deeper about these lawns as potential habitat. And so what happens every time we mow? Are we having this negative impact on the potential habitat? And so this was kind of this big aha moment. I presented this question to the National Science Foundation. They gave me a bunch of money to test these two main questions. And so it really was trying to get at this main hypothesis of whether we mow our lawns less, do we have more flowers? And if we have more flowers, do we have more bees? And again, this is about 10 years ago where everybody's newsfeed was just being blown up by the plight of the bees. So could this be a simple solution to really try to create bee habitat? And the other thing, because I'm a natural historian at heart, I was also really interested in the fact of whether or not these different types of landscapes, these lawns, were in fact these biological deserts. And so I embarked on this 2-year study in Springfield, Massachusetts. So again, this is the third largest city in our state. And I worked within 16 different yards. And so these yards got assigned these different lawn mowing frequencies. They were mowed either every week, every 2 weeks, or every 3 weeks. And did it over the course of 2013 and 2014. And so one of the things about doing urban research is that it's really, really challenging to control anything. And so as a scientist, that's something that, like, when we go out to do these studies or experiments, we're really wanting to control things so that we can really get at the main component that we're trying to test. And so I'm always really jealous about people who work in labs because you can control, or people who work out in forests or deserts or grasslands away from people because you can sort of control. But when you're working with people, everything goes out the window. But one of the things that we were able to do is we convinced everybody not to irrigate or fertilize over the course of the study for participating in this. And the other component, since our main question was looking at lawn mowing frequency, we wanted to make sure that all the yards that were assigned the 3-week mowing regime, that they in fact were only mowed every 3 weeks. So in order to do that, we provided free lawn mowing service for the course of the 2 years of the study. So that was one way for us to really try to recruit people, because again, really trying to get at some of these main questions, especially in a landscape that's so dominant in these urban and suburban areas. And in terms of the potential that these yards have for pollinator habitat, we really wanted to gain access to these private landscapes. And so this was one way of really trying to figure out, well, what does somebody get out of this study? And so we thought that this could be a really exciting way. And I have to tell you, it was actually really hard to convince people to let us mow their lawns over the course of 2 years, because people just really wanted that sense of control. Although a lot of times when I'm giving this presentation, people are like, you can use my yard. So maybe next time if we ever do the study again. So anyway, so we ended up mowing lawns for the course of the 2 years, 16 yards. It was the equivalent of us pushing the mower from Springfield down to Philadelphia and then back again. So, and then I have a picture up here on the top left. This was a yard that was mowed every week over the course of 2 years. And I think we clocked about 70 miles in that one yard. So when you think about, another component that these lawns provide in terms of an ecosystem service, if you are the one who's pushing the mower, better yet, if it's either an electric or a non-motorized mower, you're getting a lot of exercise. But anyways, this was just kind of a fun component of the study in terms of another aspect of what these lawns can provide. In terms of what we did, so we went out into these yards every week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and we would measure and count how many flowers were growing within the lawns and then also in the yards themselves, just to get a better sense of the different types of floral resources. And then every 3 weeks, we'd go in and calculate how many bees and which types of bee species were present in these yards. So to get at kind of this first part of the hypothesis, if we mow our lawns less, do we have more lawn flowers? But first, to get at some of the natural history, we identified 58 different species of flowers growing spontaneously in these lawns. So again, these are plants that nobody has planted. These are just like springing up. They're part of the seed bed. And majority of them are, or at least a third of them, we have that are native to North America. So when we think about the potential of providing biodiversity, these lawns really do have that potential, especially since they're not being fertilized or irrigated. In terms of the research question, so I'm going to show a couple of graphs. And so we have the lawn mowing frequency on the x-axis, so every week, 2 weeks, or 3 weeks. And then here we have the number of lawn flowers on the y-axis. And so as you can see, this is what I like to call confirmatory science. It's like you would expect if you mow your lawn less, then there's going to be more flowers. And lo and behold, our data demonstrate that. And so again, this was something that was expected, but up to this point, it hadn't been tested yet. So this is really nice to see that it was significant that our yards that were mowed every 3 weeks, they had, I think it was something like 200% more flowers growing in their lawn. So a lot of potential bee habitat. But the question remains, does it matter for the bees? So in terms of the natural history of these lawns, and so I actually want to point out, so the yards that we used, I've called these lawn-dominated yards. So these are not yards that have the pollinator plantings. They don't have vegetable gardens. They're pretty much lawn, a handful of plants, and that's it. Because we, again, really wanted to focus in on what was going on in these lawns. And we found a lot. So we identified 111 different species of bees, roughly 35 species per yard. And I want to put this into perspective. So 111 species. So that represents about a quarter of all bees that have been recorded in the state of Massachusetts. So that's pretty incredible. And when we think about it, because we only looked at one type of habitat, we only looked at one area, we looked in 3 neighborhoods in one part of the state. The other thing I want to point out is this beauty here, Lasioglossum ilioense. Yes, it's really drab. It's about the size of a grain of rice. There's really nothing exciting about it, other than this was the most abundant bee that we recorded. And this was kind of strange because we looked back at some of the records, and the last time Lasioglossum ilioense was recorded in the state was back in the 1920s, and also represented only by two different specimens in the eastern part of the state, outside of Boston. So we did some genetics work. We wanted to see, well, is there something interesting that's going on here? But we found out there wasn't anything exciting other than what we think was happening is it started to make a northward move. So this is a species that's really common further south in places in Maryland and also in Connecticut. And so what we might have been able to do is by focusing in a part of the landscape that nobody had really been investigating, we were able to start calculating and documenting this northern movement of the species. In terms of the types of bees that we collected, so this really gets at some of the different types of traits of bees. One of the things that I think a lot of people are surprised about is that most of the bees that we collected in these yards were native. And so both in terms of the species and the abundance, and then in terms of the families, a lot of this is, it's not too surprising. Most of the bees are from the family Halictidae. Most of these bees are nesting in the ground. And then most of these bees are, so we call this polylectic, so that means that they're generalist species. So again, these aren't really surprising. So bar charts are cool, but I just want you to just take a moment and just to look at the diversity of these bees. They're pretty stunning. I love bumblebees. They're so cute. But I remember the first time that I looked through a microscope to see some of these sweat bees, that metallic green bee, and I thought, how could a species look like that? It was just so incredible. So anyways, going back to the research question. If we mow our lawns less frequently, do we have more flowers? The answer is yes, but do we have more bees? And so I have a similar graph here. And what we were able to find was that, yes, in fact, there was a very strong relationship between the amount of flowers and the amount of bees. However, as you can see, the 2 weeks really has the most bees that we were able to document. So that was a little surprising. So it was, almost following our hypothesis, but then not quite. And so what we're started to look at is like, well, why might this happen? Like, why are we seeing this increase at 2 weeks, but then this decline in 3 weeks? And so one of the things that we think might be happening is that even though the yards that are mowed every 3 weeks have more flowers, remember, these bees are most of them are about the size of a grain of rice. So in addition to these lawns that are mowed every 3 weeks having more flowers, they also have taller grass. And so one of the thoughts we had is that it might be a little bit more difficult for these smaller bees to be able to get access. So even though there's a lot of flowers, might not necessarily equate to better habitat for the bees. But nonetheless, the 2-week mowing regime seemed to be that was a good indicator here. And again, just delighted to see that there was a strong relationship after spending, all those hours sweating, pushing that mower over and over again. So one of the things, though, when I was promoting this study, when I first got the funding, and I was telling everybody about it, everybody got really excited about, oh, wow, lawn mowing and making the lawn grow longer, let the grass grow longer. What's happened there? Everybody kept asking me, well, what about the ticks? Like, there's going to be a problem with ticks. And I thought, you're right. Because we know that ticks are a serious problem in the Northeast. So 30,000 cases of Lyme disease in Massachusetts between 2006 and 2015. So this is a serious concern, especially if we're trying to figure out ways to create habitat. We don't want to have these unintended consequences. And so I had the brilliance to be able to include surveying for ticks while I was looking at bees, rather than thinking, oh, that would have been a good thing to do. And so one of the ways that we did this, again, a very similar hypothesis, where we thought if we mow our lawns less frequently, we'll have taller grass. And if we have taller grass, then we have more ticks. And so the way that you survey for ticks is really high tech. So you take a cloth, you drag it through the yard, and then you see if there's any ticks that climb their way onto these cloths. And so we were able to do this at the same time that we were collecting our bees. And so again, we would do these tick drags right before we would mow the lawn, so right when the grass was the tallest. Again, doing those 3 different mowing frequencies. And we conducted the research the same time when we were doing our bees, but also, which coincided, same time when ticks are really active. So I just want to get a guess. How many ticks do you think we found? Too many? Any other numbers? None? Any other? So too many and none. Any other numbers in between? 100. See, this is like what I've been waiting for. So I've been giving this presentation for like the last 2 years, and I'm like, hello, out in Zoom. So now I have real people to tell me numbers. All right, so we got a lot, 0, and 100. So you were right, 0, okay? So this was really surprising. And so when you have 0 data, like a number of 0, you're just kind of like, well, what do I do with those data? So I shelved it for a while. And then in 2018, I was flipping through my consumer reports, and I saw this article. And it's like, oh, that's cool. Like, this is what I do. This is my science. This is my research. And it says, tick-proof your yard without spraying. And they recommend 4 to 4.5 inches. And so I've done the math here because we did everything in metrics. And so they're recommending to mow your lawn every week in terms of the height. And I thought, well, wait a second. If you're going to mow your lawns every week, first of all, there's no ticks. And second of all, like, you're taking away all this potential habitat for bees. So we put this together and we published these results. And it's one of the things that's really important is to put this into context. And so these 2 yards are extremely different. And so the one on the right that I have highlighted in yellow is surrounded by a lot of other yards. So this is a typical yard in Springfield, Massachusetts, and any other Springfield, USA. Whereas the yard on the left, the ticks are a lot more prevalent in the yard. However, other research has demonstrated that, yes, ticks are present in these residential landscapes. However, they're not in the lawns. They're spending their times in kind of the unmanaged parts of the yard and the stone walls and the scraggly bits. And so when we have these recommendations, they really need to be backed by science. And so again, a big part of the work that I do is really trying to provide the science behind these recommendations. Because there could be some really negative consequences about having everybody mow their lawns less frequently. If we've demonstrated that, yes, this can in fact provide habitat, but oh, you're gonna have this false sense of security of mowing your lawn frequently to get rid of ticks that aren't actually in your lawns as well. So again, this was just kind of a fun study, side part of it, and again, really demonstrates to really make sure that you have the science to back these recommendations. So let's go back to this question about, are these lawns biological deserts? And so if it were up to me, I wish all of our yards looked something like this. But I know that that takes a lot of time. And so in addition to planting these pollinator gardens and, doing all these other prairie types of landscaping, another component that we can do is mowing our lawns less. And so I hope you can see this is one of the yards that was mowed every 2 weeks, and it was just filled with flowers. And we call this the lazy lawnmower approach. And so in addition, as I mentioned, in addition to doing all this other stuff, which also takes time, it takes money, it takes a green thumb, there's these other opportunities where, you know what, I'm gonna do nothing and still feel like you're doing something. And I think this can really resonate with a lot of people to get more people involved in conservation. And so when we think about managing these yards, again, a big component is really managing people and really kind of figuring out how we can change expectations of these aesthetics, of these landscapes. And so again, this idea that these yards are these extensions of our homes. So one of the things that we did was that we created these signs for people to download for free, and I have a link at the end of the presentation, to have these signs to let the neighbors know that it's intentional, that you haven't just let the lawn go. And this, I think, is really key, because one of the things that we noticed when we would go to these yards, so every week we go to the yard and we think, this doesn't look that bad, but we have to mow it because that was part of the study. The yards every 2 weeks was like, okay, well, this one seems like it needs a good trim, so we'll mow it, and then, kind of cleaned it up a little bit. And when we got to the yards that were mowed every 3 weeks, we really had to convince ourselves that it didn't look that bad. But they did. They looked really messy. And the householders we were conducting the study, they would just run to meet us at the side of, before we even got the mower out of the car, I'm so glad you're here. My neighbors were getting really angry. And so again, really having this, these signs, I think, can really signal to our neighbors that this is something that we're doing intentionally and that we haven't just let it go. And so as I think about this study, as I mentioned again, I was trained as an ornithologist, and I really dove deep into lawns and learned so much about them. And I started thinking about there's 3 different types of lawn people. There's the person who's going to have a golf course and in their yard, and that's what they want. They get a lot of pride out of that. I don't think my research is ever going to reach them, and that's okay. There's the people that are the lazy lawnmower already, and they feel validated. They have told me, they have thanked me. I've been able to solve marriage problems. I've been able to solve neighbor issues. So for them, they're just really excited, again, to have the science to back up, to let their neighbors know, I'm not just letting the yard go, I'm doing something for the bees. And so I think that's another person. And then there's the group in the middle. And so these are, I think, a large percentage of lawn care people, householders who they don't really know what to do. So they might have moved into these houses and they have a lawn and they see their neighbor creating a golf course and think, maybe that's what I should do. Or they might see their other neighbor who's just let their lawns go and think, oh, well, maybe I could do that too. So again, really trying to figure out how do we reach these people to really try to provide a different opportunity for mowing these landscapes. And so again, I feel like this is where the research, you can't get it to everybody, but at least there's a couple of groups of people that I think this research can really try to start shifting the needle a little bit. And so we'll just leave it, let me just get a quick drink here. All right. So this is the new part. This is why I spent all the time looking for this presentation. So as I mentioned early in this previous talk, the previous part is that these yards really can provide wildlife habitat. And as I mentioned, there's these different types of programs. So specifically, the National Wildlife Federation has this program where you can certify your yard as wildlife habitat. Has anybody in here heard of this program? Anybody have a certified yard? Okay. So it's really great. I think there's something like 300,000 yards that have been certified throughout the United States, and they have schoolyards that are certified, there's neighborhoods that get certified, and there's a whole bunch of other types of programs as well. So the National Audubon Society has a certification program, and you don't even have to get certified. There's all of these books, there's these programs from Extension that just provide all this types of information about what types of plants to include and where to get them and things like that. But the question is, like, do they actually work? And so really wanting to, again, get the science behind these programs and these management recommendations to make sure that we're not selling these false goods. And so I've been working with a group of about 15 or 20 scientists to really get at that particular question. And so let me just show this map here. So we've been looking at 6 cities across the United States: Boston, Baltimore, Miami, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Phoenix, and Los Angeles. And within these 6 different cities, we're looking at different types of ways that people are landscaping their yards. So in the previous research, I was talking about just in terms of one type of management, just lawn mowing. And so we wanted to expand that to look at a whole bunch of different types of ways people are landscaping. So we have this wildlife friendly, so this would be a certified yard from the National Wildlife Federation. Yards that have some sort of water conservation. So in the east, these would be yards with rain gardens. Out west would be yards that are doing xeriscaping, so using a lot of drought-tolerant types of plants. And then 2 different types of lawn management. So we're calling these high lawn management. So these would be the golf course people that are applying chemicals and fertilizer and irrigation. And then the lazy lawnmower type as well. And so really wanting to get a sense of, how do these yards compare to these more wild places? So we looked at 2 different types of parks. So we're calling these reference parks. So that would be, like at least in Boston, we did a lot of Mass Audubon properties. And then these interstitial parks. So these would be kind of these vacant lands in between, like around some of these residential areas that aren't managed like these yards. And I was mainly interested in how wildlife responds. And so we have research that came out about birds, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about our bee research, and then we looked at ground bugs as well. But as I mentioned, there's about 15 of us on this project, and so I'm the sole wildlife biologist. So there's people that are looking at plants, looking at the way the soils are retaining nutrients based on these different types of landscape designs, looking at carbon and nitrogen storage, and then also some of the governance structures, like what are the rules and regulations within these different yards. But the main hypothesis that we're really testing is, do these wildlife certified yards, do they behave more like the parks compared to the other types of yards? And so again, really trying to figure out, like, do they matter? Do they work? And really trying to look at that. Again, for this part of the study and for the bees, we only looked at Boston and Baltimore, Phoenix and Los Angeles. And the thing that actually was kind of neat about this is that we're able to look at these 2 northeastern cities and 2 southwestern cities. So kind of these temperate and arid cities. And so what we found is, I'm going to show 2 figures here. And these are called rarefaction curves. And so on the x-axis is the number of individual bees that we collected, and then on the y-axis is the species diversity, so the different types of bees that we collected. And so the way to read these is, so like the solid part of the line, so that's the actual numbers of bees that we collected and the species that we collected. And then the dashed part is, if we were to continue collecting more bees, would we get more species? And so when the curve kind of flattens out, it means that no matter how much more you sample, you're not going to be able to pick up any new species. So if any of you like taken ecology classes like the species area relationship, so that's pretty much what this is about. It's kind of getting at that. But so this is from Baltimore, Maryland, and our results from Boston were also very similar. So the take-home message here is that our yards in these northeastern cities have higher species diversity. So the yards are much better. And so you see the wildlife certified yards in purple, that's one of the best in terms of the number of species that are present. What we found in Phoenix, and also as I mentioned, similar in Los Angeles, is flipped, is so that you have the parks that are much better for bees and wildlife certified yards. So this was really kind of interesting to really get a sense of how wildlife certified yards played out. And it seems like, in fact, these certified yards are doing something really good for bees. And so then, we aren't able to say why, because we didn't look at specific components. However, one of the things that we did notice, though, throughout the study is that perhaps some of these yards that are certified wildlife habitat have more bare ground, more dead stems, and more floral resources. This part we know for sure. We know that there's more plant diversity in these wildlife certified yards. These are all really key components for providing habitat for bees. And so, again, really demonstrating that yes, in fact, when we do garden for wildlife, it really can provide habitat. So the final study I want to get to, and this is one that we just are getting started, is to look at this idea about lawns for endangered bees. And so for the most part, most of the bees that are visiting these landscapes are these generalist species, a lot of these common bees. We had a few specialists, but most of the specialist bees that I just presented in the last part of the study are found out in the parks. Has anybody heard of the rusty-patched bumblebee? So what do you know about the rusty-patched bumblebee? Not much. So they're pretty cute. They've got this nice rusty patch. Rusty-patched bumblebee is the first bee to get listed as an endangered species under the Endangered Species Act. And that happened in February of 2017. Not really something that a bee will want to be the first of and be known for. But one of the things that's really interesting is, so this is a map from the Fish and Wildlife Service that demonstrates the X's, if you can see them, is like where they used to be, and then the dots really represent where they still are. And so I want just to hone in on this one area that I've highlighted here, and this is Minneapolis-St. Paul. And this actually turns out to be a stronghold of this species. Like some of the best habitat and the most abundance are found in the Twin Cities. And so thinking about lawns, again, they cover a huge amount of our landscapes, and also the potential for lawns to provide habitat if we're managing them in a different way. So thinking about these two components, the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources Department, this is a state agency, they came up with this program called Lawns to Legumes to figure out whether there's a way to plant their way out of this endangered bee species. And so this is a really cool program. They provide rebates to householders where you can get money to transform your yard or your lawn, and creating these bee lawns of planting different types of flowers in your lawn to really provide habitat. And this program, even though it's for all pollinators in general, it was specifically targeted for rusty-patched bumblebee. Again, really trying to figure out if there's a way, an opportunity for householders to contribute to conservation. And so I'm working with a team in the Twin Cities. It's the Minneapolis-St. Paul Long-Term Ecological Research Project. And so this is one of two urban long-term ecological research projects that's funded by the National Science Foundation. The other one being Phoenix, Arizona, another one that I work at. And so these LTER sites, has anyone heard of these LTER sites? Has anyone been to Plum Island? So Plum Island is, parts of Plum Island is part of this ecological research program. Hubbard Brook up in New Hampshire is another one. Has anyone been to the Harvard Forest in Petersham? So that's another LTER. And so most of these LTERs are in these more pristine wilderness areas. There's a couple in Antarctica, there's up in the White Mountains, and looking at grasslands and forests and coasts and deserts. And so about 20 plus years ago, National Science Foundation acknowledged that cities were in fact ecosystems and worthy of study. And so Phoenix has been going on since 1997, and Baltimore was also another urban LTER. And so recently, Minneapolis, St. Paul has replaced Baltimore as another urban LTER to really get at, what's going on long-term change-wise in terms of nature. And so one of the projects that I'm leading in this Minneapolis-St. Paul LTER is really, again, this theme of my research is testing whether or not these lawns to legumes programs work. There's some preliminary results that demonstrate that bees are using these bee lawns, but they only looked at 8 parks. So we're looking at about 80 yards scattered throughout the Twin Cities. And we're going to get at some really key questions about that are really kind of driving urban ecology. So in terms of how big, how many, and where do we place these lawns? Really trying to get a sense so that, again, when we work with managers, we can let them know, can you have a square that's about this big, or do you need something the size of this room? Or is it something in between? And really trying to get at that component. Another key component that we're looking at is to make sure that these bee lawns and bee habitat and the associated pollination services, the ecosystem services, are equally distributed across the city. There's been a lot of research that has demonstrated that there's unequal access to biodiversity based on income and race and ethnicity. And so when we're thinking about providing these ecosystem services, one of the parts of our research, a big part of our research, is again making sure, find out who is getting access and who is not getting access, and how can we work with folks and partners to really make sure that everybody has access, if they want them, to the pollination services and bees. And in addition to providing pollinator habitat, these bee lawns that I have here pictured on the left, there's all these other benefits as well. And so we're also looking at the plant diversity, we're looking at the water holding capacity, looking at stormwater runoff. So again, really trying to see these multiple benefits for providing these bee lawns. And so comparing yards that have been certified as these bee lawns to some of these other types of lawn types of management. So maybe in 5 years or so, I'll come back and I'll explain some of the results that we had. So again, really trying to get at this component about having science to inform management. Okay, thank you for sticking with me as we get through here. So again, want to return to my favorite picture here. Again, the National Wildlife Federation. Our yards can be for the bees. So we really can provide wildlife habitat depending on the different types of management practices. And one of the things that I also want to really highlight is that there's something for everybody, and that there's not a one-size-fits-all. And again, I think that's also really key. Rather than saying you have to have these pollinator gardens, something like this, of reducing all of your lawn, it's like, if this is what you want to do, then there's probably going to be more benefits, more biodiversity benefits, but there's also going to take a little more time. So maybe this arrow isn't completely accurate here. But there's other ways. You can do a bee lawn. You can do, mowing your lawn less frequently. There's this whole idea about no mow May. Has anyone heard about that? Where you don't mow your lawn for the entire month of May. And there's, again, research that's demonstrating that can be pretty effective. So again, really providing multiple opportunities for everybody to contribute to bee conservation, I think is something really key. In addition to bee conservation for everyone, it's also thinking about bee conservation everywhere. And so even though the research that I've presented is really focused in the suburbs, it could probably has huge implications in some of these more rural landscapes of these yards. And so yards go across the urban to rural gradient. They're not just an urban component. And so a yard that's next to agricultural fields might be even more important to make sure that we're providing some sort of pollinator habitat, something as simple as mowing our lawns less frequently. And then to think beyond yards. So there's all of these lawns everywhere. Remember, the 163,800 square kilometers of lawn is not just these residential landscapes. And so there's all of these opportunities for us to contribute. And so with that, I'd be happy to take some questions. As I mentioned, if you go into my website, you can eventually somehow you'll get to these lawn these downloadable signs if you're interested in putting those out when it becomes mowing season. And I also just want to thank all of my colleagues that have helped with this research. It's a huge effort. And yeah, I'd be happy to take some questions.